one of the things that's happened in the industry over the last number of years is that a lot of the new production is mostly all gear culture, and I would say that the vast majority of that is gear that's grown on the surface, so floating cages and bags and things like that. It's a major differentiator. If we're talking about running an oyster program or trying to build a list or whatever in that kind of decision tree, probably one of the first things you should ask is, what was the growing method? And we have all these one sheets and it says, oh, they're growing in bags on the surface, this and that. But it's really, at the top, pretty binary. It's like either they're planted on the bottom or they're grown in gear. And that's a major differentiator. It's a big thing, and I think it doesn't get talked about enough, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about it today. And one of the reasons why a lot of the new production is all in gear or floating gear is because it allows you to grow in areas that have challenges. So some of the earlier farms on the West Coast, here on the East Coast, kind of picked the areas that had the very specific set of environmental conditions that allow you to plant on the bottom. And the other major driver for that is that back in the day, 25 years ago, when Island Creek was starting, 30 years ago, some of our other kind of peers, no one had any money. There was no bank was going to give you any money. There was no programming to get federal funds. So there was no money to buy gear. So you just had to plant them on the bottom. And now that the industry is a little more established, new entrants, they have access to capital, and they're also going into areas that, aren't necessarily suited for bottom planting. So that's why you see a lot more kind of production happening in gear now. This is a picture of our farm. The Island Creeks are bottom planted, as I mentioned. This is a low tide in the summer, early morning. We call them picking tides. And essentially, this is the work that happens at low tide on a bottom cultured farm. You have to think of it more like they're kind of free-range oysters. The seed and nursery process is very intensive, but once they get planted out, we don't touch them for 14, 18 months until we go out and harvest them again, which is really good in some ways and challenging in others, and we'll talk about that. So yeah, I talked about that, but they're really like that type of bottom culture it's like pasture-raised beef or, whatever it may be. It's essentially free-range farming, and it's a lot more like ranching at that point, where we just send them out to pasture for most of their lives after they kind of reach about basically a quarter inch. And then we go get them when we're ready to harvest them. And there's nothing that happens in between. So one of the downsides to that is you get less shape consistency because we go to great lengths to try to plant them far apart from one another at low density. We either use a shovel, and you have to have a very well-trained member of the farm crew go and do the certain shake with the shovel as the boat goes along in a grid pattern. Or we actually have tried salt spreaders from snow plows to cast this quarter-inch seed evenly on the bottom. But at the end of the day, they end up getting moved around by the current or by ice in the winter, and they end up where they end up. And sometimes that's on top of a rock or it's on top of another oyster. So this is a good example of, it's not like a wild oyster where they're growing in clumps and reefs and things like that, and you get all these gnarly shapes, but it's somewhere in the middle between that and oyster that's grown in a bag or a tray. Some of the very specific environmental conditions I mentioned for bottom planting are, it can't be too muddy. If it's too muddy, the seed will sink and suffocate. It can't be too sandy. If it's too sandy, they get blown away in storms, primarily even just strong current when the seed's very small. When it's first planted and it's totally unprotected, they get blown all over the bay, which is not good. And the other big thing is it can't have predation pressure. So there's a lot of things that like to eat oysters. Further down south, it's rays, it's diving ducks, moon snails, you name it. Green crabs eat them. You can't have a huge population of predators in an area we're going to bottom plant because obviously there's nothing to protect them. Yeah, go ahead.